Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun was coming up over the Mogollon Rim when Adeline Harper stepped off the eastbound freight wagon with her daughter in one arm, a rifle slung across her back, and nothing left to lose. She had not planned on stopping in Willow Creek. But the wagon driver said his horses needed water, and the girl, Penny, had not stopped coughing since Santa Fe. So Adeline climbed down, boots hitting red dust, her eyes already searching for trouble. She was used to finding it, especially in men. The dusty main street was quiet, lined with wooden storefronts and weather-worn signs. A saloon with its doors wide open, a smithy hammering in the distance, and a sheriff's office with a cracked window. She held Penny a little tighter. "Ma," the girl whispered, her voice dry and weak. "My chest hurts." "I know, baby. Hold on." Adeline glanced toward the general store, then toward the water trough where a man stood brushing down a paint horse. He wore a brown hat, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, and his back was to her. She moved fast, heading toward the store, but the door was locked. A sign in the window read, "Closed for delivery back by noon." She muttered a curse under her breath. "Ma'am," came a voice behind her. Deep calm. "You need help?" Adeline turned, sharp and wary. The cowboy stood a few feet away, hands down at his sides, eyes steady. He looked to be near 30, tall, with dusty boots and a kind face lined with sun. Not handsome in the way her last one had been slick, smooth, all smiles and lies but solid. Like a man who did what he said he would do. "No," she said quickly, stepping back. "We're fine." He looked at Penny, saw the pale skin and the way the girl leaned heavy against her mother. "You do not look fine," he said gently. "There's a doctor half a mile west. I can take you." "I do not need your help," she snapped. The man nodded like he heard that often. "Name's Fletcher Morgan," he said, not moving closer. "Horse is saddled if you change your mind." He turned and walked back toward the trough, leaving her heart pounding and her fists clenched. The last man who offered to help had smiled the same way. Had said the same kinds of things. Then he took everything. Penny coughed again, a deep rattle that brought Adeline to her knees. She pressed her hand to the girl's forehead. Burning, she looked over her shoulder. Fletcher was still there, rinsing his horse's bit. Adeline swallowed hard. "Wait," he looked up. "Will the doctor even see us?" she asked, voice cracking. "I do not have money." "He will," Fletcher said, already walking back. "You are with me." She hesitated, and he held out his hand not to her but to Penny. "I will ride double," he said softly. "You can sit behind." Penny looked up at her mother, too sick to smile, but her eyes pleading. Adeline nodded stiffly. She climbed on behind Fletcher, holding Penny between them. The man's coat smelled like leather and dust and horses. He did not speak. He did not touch her. Just rode steady, the sun climbing slow and hot above them. The doctor was a tired man with spectacles and a gruff voice, but he checked Penny over and poured something bitter down her throat. Said it was a fever from the dust and heat, but she would pull through. "She needs a quiet place, water, rest," he said. "And food if you can get it." Adeline stiffened. "We are not staying, just passing through." "Might not be smart," Fletcher said quietly, still standing in the doorway. "Not with her this sick." Adeline turned to face him. "You think I do not know what men like you are after, I think," Fletcher said. "You have been hurt bad. I also think that girl is more important to you than your pride." She stared at him, heart thudding. He looked back without blinking. "I have a cabin 2 miles north. Barn, fresh well, no one else. You both can stay. No strings." "No such thing," she said coldly. But when Penny coughed again, her body trembling against Adeline's arms, she gave a slow nod. The cabin was clean, tidy. A rough cot, a kitchen table, a stove with wood already stacked beside it. Fletcher gave them the bed and slept on the floor without argument. That night, Adeline sat by the fire, brushing Penny's damp hair off her forehead. Fletcher sat across the room, reading from a worn book. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, voice low. He looked up. "Because I can." "That is not a reason." He shut the book. "You think I want something? Every man does." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I lost my wife 2 winters ago. Fever took her quick. We had no children. She was kind. You remind me a little of her, except you are sharper." Meaner, Adeline's mouth twitched. Life does that. I am not trying to change you, he said, but you do not have to sleep with one eye open here. She looked away, brushing Penny's cheek. Fletcher stood, picked up his blanket, and walked out to the porch. Door stays unlocked, he said over his shoulder. Adeline lay awake a long time after, watching the fire fade, listening to her daughter breathe. She thought of the last man, how he had smiled, taken her in, then turned cold the moment she said no. How he had hit her. How he had taken the little money she had hidden. But Fletcher had not even looked at her that way, had not asked questions, had not touched her once. The next morning, Fletcher was already outside cutting wood. Penny was still asleep, her fever down. Adeline stepped out onto the porch. I will earn our keep, she said. He paused, axe mid-swing. You do not have to. I will cook, clean, hunt if you let me, he nodded. All right. They fell into a rhythm. Adeline cooked while Penny rested. Fletcher taught her how to use the old stove. She learned where he kept the salt, the flour, the coffee. Found herself waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch. He never asked questions, never got too close. But he saw everything when she winced at loud noises, when she flinched from sudden movement. He never asked why. One afternoon, she found him patching a broken fence. She walked up with a tin of water and handed it to him. You are not like him, she said quietly. Fletcher took the water, drank. I know. She looked up at him, really saw him, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. The way his hands were calloused but gentle. I thought you would be cruel, she said. Like the last man, I know, he said again, but I am not. She stepped in close. I want to trust you. Then do. She reached for his hand, he let her. And for the first time in a long while, her chest did not feel so tight. Inside, Penny laughed from the bedroom. Adeline smiled. And Fletcher smiled back. The monsoon rains came early that year, rolling over the high desert with sudden force, flattening dry grass and soaking the red earth, until it turned to clay beneath their boots. Fletcher had just returned from trading cornmeal and a cured elk hide in town when the first heavy drops started to fall. Adeline was already on the porch, one hand steadying the roof beam, watching the clouds darken like spilled ink across the sky. You'll want to stable him, she said without turning. That rain's got weight in it. Fletcher nodded, leading the horse around the side. When he came back, his hat and shoulders glistened, and she handed him a rough towel from the line. I boiled beans, she said, stepping inside. They'll be ready by supper. He peeled off his coat near the door, steam lifting from the fabric. Penny still sleeping, she's drawing. Adeline tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You had pencils in the drawer, she's careful with them. I remember, he said. They were my wife's. Adeline paused near the stove. You don't talk much about her. She kept mostly to herself. Liked birds, painted them in those little sketchbooks. I never learned to draw, she said, voice low. Didn't have time for much like that. He looked over at her, the silence between them steady and warm. You do plenty now. That night, the wind shook the shutters and the kettle hissed over the fire. Penny showed them a picture of a rabbit she'd drawn in charcoal, and Fletcher praised it without affectation. He didn't overdo things. Adeline noticed that. He gave only what was true. The next morning, the creek behind the cabin had risen with the rain. Fletcher took a shovel and cleared a channel away from the foundation. Adeline came out with a cloth tied over her hair and sleeves rolled up to her elbows. I'll help, she said. You don't need, I want to. They worked without speaking at first, the smell of wet cedar rising around them. Her hands were fast, unafraid of mud, and she didn't shy from getting dirty. Fletcher handed her the shovel when his arm tired, and she took it without comment. When the water finally bent away from the cabin, they sat on the porch steps. Penny was inside, humming to herself, her voice thin but steadier than it had been days before. You always live this far out? Adeline asked. After she died, I didn't care for town. Easier to be useful out here. You don't miss people, some, he admitted, but most don't say what they mean or they want something. I used to think that's just how it was, she said. Take what you can get before someone else takes it first. He didn't answer, just rested an arm across his knee and watched the sky break open in patches of blue. Later that week, a neighbor rode up. His name was Illy Granger, a rancher from 4 miles north with a sour mouth and a habit of chewing tobacco so hard it left dark stains down his chin. He dismounted slow, eyes falling on Adeline with too much interest. "Didn't know you had company," he said to Fletcher, tugging at his gloves. Fletcher stood without moving. "You need something, Illy?" "Looking for a tool I lent you last spring, iron rasp, thought I'd ride by. I left it on your porch a month back. Your boy told me he found it." Granger's jaw moved side to side. "That's so well. Maybe I came by for more than that." Adeline stepped back toward the doorway. Penny peeked out behind her skirts. Fletcher's voice stayed level. "She's not here for you to look at." Granger spat into the grass. "Didn't figure she was yours." "She's under my roof," Fletcher said. "That's enough." Granger looked at him a moment longer, then gave a rueful snort. "You always did keep strays, Morgan." "Ride on," Fletcher said, quieter now. Granger mounted, turned, and rode off without another word. Inside, Adeline pulled Penny close. "We won't stay where we aren't wanted." Fletcher closed the door behind him. "That man's got nothing to say about it." "You sure?" she asked. He looked at her then, eyes steady as they had been the first day. "Next time I'll say it louder." She looked down at her hands, the small tremble in her fingers betraying what she couldn't say out loud. That evening, Fletcher brought in extra firewood and bolted the door. Adeline didn't ask if he'd done it for them. She already knew. After Penny went to sleep, Adeline stayed up by the hearth, sewing a button back on one of his shirts. She didn't ask if she could, just did it. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't think I'll go now." She met his eyes across the firelight. "Why not?" "Because you're here." She didn't say anything to that, but she set the finished shirt on the chair beside him, stood and pressed her palm to his shoulder before walking back to her room. It was the first time she touched him without reason, and it didn't feel small. The first frost came with a hush. It laced the cornstalks in the back field with silver and rimmed the cabin's windows in clear, delicate veins. Penny pressed her finger to the cold glass before dawn, drawing tiny circles in the white sheen while Adeline stoked the fire back to life. Fletcher had already gone out. She heard the creak of his boots on the porch before he entered, arms full of kindling and his breath steaming in the morning air. His cheeks were red with cold, his coat dusted with frost. "There's a buck down by the hollow," he said, setting the wood near the stove. "Tracks say he's bedding close. I'll try for him later." Adeline nodded, brushing ash from her palms. "I'll keep water on for the hide." He paused, unlacing his gloves. "You still planning to do all that yourself?" "I always tanned my own." "Less waste that way." "Figure that's true," he said, and she saw the small pull at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, more a quiet approval. By midday, the sun warmed the frost off the roof, and Fletcher took Penny to help gather hickory nuts down by the creek. Adeline stayed behind, scraping down the old table with vinegar and a rag, the scent sharp and clean in the still air. When they returned, Penny's cheeks were flushed with color and she carried a small cloth sack in both hands, proud and careful. Fletcher followed behind with a length of twisted rope over his shoulder. "We found a rabbit caught in Illy Granger's wire snare," he said. "Still alive. Penny wanted to let it go." "She talked you into it?" Adeline asked, lifting one brow. "She didn't have to," he said. "No sense killing what you don't need." Penny tugged at her mother's skirt. "It hopped away fast. I think it was scared." Adeline placed her hand on her daughter's head, fingers resting in her hair. "Most things are when they're caught." That night, Fletcher brought a small cedar box in from the barn, wrapped in cloth and smelling faintly of beeswax. He set it on the table without ceremony while Adeline poured boiled cornmeal into a pan. "I kept this after she passed," he said. "Didn't know what for." Adeline dried her hands on a towel. "You don't have to show me." "I want to." She undid the cloth slowly. Inside were brushes, some worn thin, a few pieces of charcoal, and paper curled at the corners. At the bottom, a tiny carved bird no bigger than her thumb painted red with careful black eyes. "She made that?" Adeline asked, voice quieter than before. "Whittled it herself. Gave it to me the day we buried our stillborn." Adeline's hand stopped over the bird. "I didn't know you'd lost a child." "No one does," he said. "We buried him by the cottonwood grove, no name." Adeline looked up at him, her eyes no longer guarded, only tired. "Mine was named Samuel. Fever took him when he was 2. Penny was just a baby." Fletcher didn't move. "I'm sorry. She never knew him. I don't talk about it." "You don't have to," he said, "but I'll listen if you ever do." She nodded once. Then twice, later when Penny was asleep and the fire had dimmed, Adeline stepped out onto the porch. Fletcher was sitting on the top step, arms resting on his knees, his coat collar turned up against the chill. "I never thought I'd stay anywhere long," she said, not looking at him. "Not after what we ran from. You still can leave if you need to." "I don't want to," she said. "That's the part I don't know what to do with." He turned toward her, moonlight catching the edge of his face. "You don't have to do anything yet." She sat beside him, their shoulders close but not touching. "You haven't asked for anything." "Not once." "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted something different." She looked down at her hands. "I used to think being safe meant being alone. And now I'm starting to question that." He didn't reach for her, didn't move. But she leaned against him, slow and deliberate, her shoulder pressing into his. He stayed still, letting her decide. They sat that way for a long time, watching the stars come out in quiet clusters, the cold air turning sharper, the trees rustling soft in the dark. Inside, Penny's small breaths came steady through the open window. Adeline closed her eyes. Not sleeping, just resting against something that didn't flinch or take or demand. And Fletcher stayed beside her, solid and quiet, like he would be there as long as she needed. The late autumn sun hung low, shadows stretching long over the fields. Fletcher had strung up corn husks beneath the porch eaves, drying them for kindling. Adeline stood beside the cookstove, her sleeves pushed to her elbows as she shaped dough with nimble fingers. Penny sat at the table, tracing the edge of a tin cup with quiet concentration, her hair falling in a neat braid down her back. The wind had changed. It held a bite that meant snow wasn't far off. "You ever seen a blizzard?" Fletcher asked, setting his gloves on the peg beside the door. "Once," Adeline said, brushing flour from her hands. "Back in Kansas. Roof cracked halfway through the storm. We had to burn the pantry shelves to keep warm." He studied her a moment. "You managed to keep them both alive, just Penny by then." She didn't look up. "I got us through." He nodded slowly, then gestured to the dough. "You make that by memory or feeling?" "Both. My mother taught me before she passed, said a woman should know how to feed herself even if no one else ever did." Fletcher stepped closer, leaned over to look at the dough. "I'd say she taught you right." Adeline turned toward him. "You ever think about marrying again?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, a hawk let out a high cry, circling once over the hills before disappearing behind the ridge. "I did for a while," he said at last. "But I didn't want to carry grief into something new, felt like bringing a stone to a well." Adeline nodded, her brow furrowing. "I know what that weight feels like." He touched the edge of the table, fingers tapping once. "You think you'd try again? With the wrong man?" "No." She met his eyes. "With a good one, maybe." Penny looked up from her cup. "Can we go to the hills tomorrow? I want to find pine cones." Adeline paused, then looked to Fletcher. "If the weather holds," he said. "And your boots fit tight." "They do," the girl said, beaming. The next morning, they packed a small sack of biscuits and wrapped a blanket around Penny's shoulders. The hills rose soft and golden beneath the blue sky, pine needles crunching underfoot. Fletcher led them through a narrow trail winding between stone outcrops and tall junipers. Penny ran ahead, basket swinging, her laughter echoing in the stillness. "She's stronger than she was," Fletcher said. "She's always been strong," Adeline replied. "She just needed somewhere to stop running." They reached a small clearing where the sun fell in broad beams. Fletcher crouched near a fallen log, brushing aside leaves until he found a cluster of pale mushrooms. "Edible?" she asked, stepping beside him. He nodded. "Good for stew." My wife used to dry them on the sill. Adeline knelt, inspecting the stems. You know a lot about what grows here, I had to learn. After she passed, I didn't have much appetite, but I still had to eat. She glanced sideways. I forgot what it was like to feel hunger without fear. Fletcher looked at her, his voice low. You don't have to forget. But you can let it rest. They walked back as the light began to fade, Penny's basket full of pine cones and dried seed pods. That night, Adeline added the mushrooms to a pot of broth and let it simmer while Fletcher sat beside the hearth, mending a tear in his coat. I found a letter, he said after a while, from my brother in Missouri, wants me to come help him with his cattle next spring. Adeline stirred the stew. Will you go? I told him I couldn't leave here. Not now. She didn't answer, but he saw the way her shoulders eased, the way her hand stilled on the spoon. He rose, crossing the room to where she stood. I've been thinking something, he said. She turned to face him, wary but curious. I never wanted to belong to someone again. But I'd like to belong with. She searched his face, her voice barely above a whisper. You sure? I've never been more. She reached for his hand slowly, fingers threading through his. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters gently. But inside, the warmth held steady and sure. Penny slept in the corner, curled beneath a wool blanket, her face peaceful. Adeline leaned her head against Fletcher's chest, eyes closed, and he held her there as if he'd known her shape all along. The snow came in the night, quiet and thick. By morning, the world outside the cabin had turned to white. The hills softened beneath a clean, heavy blanket, the rough shapes of the corral and barn roof rounded under weight. Adeline stood with the door cracked open, breath fogging the cold air, a wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Fletcher was already outside, his coat dusted, leading the mare to the lean to where he'd added extra thatching the week before. His movements were slow, deliberate, every gesture purposeful in the still morning. She watched him for a moment, how he paused to check the latch, how he rubbed the animal's neck with care, then closed the door and set another log on the fire. Penny sat near the hearth, threading a bit of blue yarn through the hem of a worn scrap of linen. Her cheeks carried a faint flush from sleep. Could I give it to him? She asked without looking up. Adeline knelt beside her. You want to? I never made anything for a man before, not one who stayed. Adeline's throat tightened. She nodded, brushing a curl back from the girl's forehead. He'll like it. That evening, Fletcher brought in a brace of grouse. The birds were already gutted, feathers tucked into a sack for later use. He handed the meat to Adeline without a word, then knelt to remove his boots near the fire, steam lifting faintly from the leather. You think it'll hold through the week? He asked. The storm, she glanced toward the window, feels like it might. Then we're stocked well enough, he said. I've got salted beans, cornmeal, dried apples too. I found a jar of lard behind the flour bin, she added. Not spoiled. He turned to her, resting his arm over one knee. You think about what you want to do after the thaw. Adeline didn't answer right away. She finished plucking the small feathers from the bird, wiped her hands on a cloth, and sat across from him. I don't see the point in leaving, he watched her, waiting. I've moved enough for 10 lives, she said, and Penny, she's steadier here, she laughs more. Fletcher leaned back slightly, but his eyes didn't stray. Then stay. Adeline felt the words settle in her chest like a stone finally finding the bottom of a river. I will, she said. He stood, crossed to the hearth, and reached into the pocket of his coat. From it, he pulled a small bundle wrapped in plain muslin. She recognized the stitch her own from a scarf she'd mended weeks ago. He handed it to her without preamble. Inside was a brooch, old but polished, a deep green stone set in silver. Not new, not expensive, but clearly cared for. I found it in my wife's things, he said. She had no sisters. No daughters. I think she'd want someone strong wearing it. Adeline looked down at it, then back up. I'm not asking for anything in return, he said. I just want you to have it. She fastened it to her collar. I'll wear it every day. That night, the wind pressed hard against the roof and the windows rattled in their panes. Fletcher sat up late, whittling a bit of pine into something small and round. You carving again? Adeline asked, watching the curl of wood fall to the floor. Been a while, he said. Thought Penny might like a new button for that doll she made. She'll love it. He paused, knife hovering. You sure you want this? A cabin, a quiet life. I never wanted loud, she said. I only wanted safe and kind and steady. He set the knife down. Then you've got it. She crossed to him, knelt beside the chair and rested her hand over his. I love you, she said. He looked at her, surprised but not startled. I've loved you since you first stepped off that wagon and told me no. She leaned in slowly, and he met her halfway, their hands still joined between them, the fire casting long shadows up the walls. They married in March after the first thaw, beneath the cottonwood grove where Fletcher had once buried his son. Penny scattered wildflower seeds in the wind, her dress patched and proud. The preacher rode out from town and said the words with quiet dignity. Illy Granger didn't show his face. The neighbors sent jars of pickled vegetables, a coil of rope, and a blanket woven with red thread. It was more than Adeline had ever been given for anything. Fletcher built a second room onto the cabin that spring, so Penny could have a space of her own. Adeline helped raise the beams, her hands calloused but sure. At night they lay beneath the quilt Fletcher's mother had left him, listening to the frogs sing by the creek. By summer, the garden behind the house held beans and squash. Penny kept a journal with drawings of every plant she could name. Adeline taught her how to boil dye from onion skins and walnut husks. Fletcher came in one afternoon, smelling of sweat and hay, and kissed Adeline on the temple before unbuckling his belt and hanging it on the wall. You still glad you stayed? He asked. She rested her hand over his heart. Every single day. They grew old together in that house beside the creek, with the wind in the pines and the mountains watching over them. And from that day on, neither Adeline nor Fletcher ever had to run again.